All right. It's Dr. Collins on behalf of the Advanced Orthogonal Institute. And today, you can see it. It's a sagittal film. But before we get into the sagittal film, real quick plug. We got seminars coming up. And June is our boot camp. If you haven't been to an AdvO seminar in a while, now's the time. Our group is really getting on the ball. We got a new website up. But check it out. I'll put links in the description for this video. But we got a boot camp in June and then annual conference, if I can click it properly, in November. So back to the view here. Sagittal film. And this time, listen, I'm really trying to make this video as beneficial for docs and students as possible. Even a quick reference for those of us who have been doing this forever. I got notes. So today, I actually printed up notes. So by way of introduction, this is the sagittal film. And the real question, and I didn't introduce this on the frontal film video, but why even analyze and have a systematic X-ray analysis protocol for your procedure? And the line is, patients don't get well from being adjusted. They get well from holding an adjustment. So the purpose of these films, right? It's easy to forget this when we do this day in, day out, or we're not even studying it yet. The purpose is to make sure we're formulating an exact line of drive, and we know the biomechanical influences that should be going into this system to address misalignment, malpositioning of these structures. So again, by way of introduction, we got 4 views. Sagittal, which if you're getting into upper cervical work, you could associate this with like a lateral. Frontals and axials, which are going to be on that Z-axis, and the horizontal top-down kind of Y-axis view. The sagittal, however, this is our X-axis view. This is the first view I'm going to take, right? It gives me the information to take the next view. And it's also the last one I end up analyzing when I'm digging out the transverse process location. So this is your foundational film here, and it's easy to breeze past this and say it's not as interesting as a frontal film, but there are a lot of implications from this sagittal X-ray. And by way of setup, when you set this film up, we're at 46 inches, right, tube to bucky. You are making sure you are aligning that tube and bucky to their head tilt. You're not maneuvering the patient's head. You're just using the chair to rotate them to eliminate rotation. And we're making sure that from the central ray standpoint, that kind of horizontal line of that central ray is hitting the EAM, the mandible line, and then the vertical is hitting that EAM running through there. In terms of, is this a clean view or not? And I'll take some of this off. This is already one that's been analyzed, but we'll pretend it hasn't been, right? You should have rami, right? You'll see those jaw lines should be superimposed. This isn't the best example, but that rami, if I'm kind of dropping this line here, you should want to see those as close as superimposed, both, that aspect of it, and then also down here, right? You want to see one right on top of the other. You do have 2 slightly visible. And then, you could potentially have the skull completely perfect on here and have these be off as well, which is worth mentioning because you could have trauma to this jaw. So how would you reference that? Well, you'd look at your ocular orbits. So if everything is perfectly aligned, kind of giving you some reference to look at here. Like, let's say these ocular orbits are superimposed. Well, let's say they're not. Let's say one's staggered, anterior and posterior or superior, inferior. That will give you information when you're even assessing if this is a credible view to take and measure on. But that would be sort of your setup. So an acceptable sagittal film again, by way of introduction, before I start dropping real lines here, is going to give you three main bits of information that are all incredibly important. So one, an atlas sagittal plane line. Two, an axial angle. And three, the location of your transverse process. And for anybody out there watching, it's not necessarily in the middle of the tragus notch, but I'll get into it. And then sort of your bonus would be the advanced orthogonal principle called dimensional transpositioning. So I'll kind of touch on all these. If we're going to construct an atlas sagittal plane line, all right, let's kind of zoom in here. I should place a dot where the lateral mass and posterior arch intersect. Okay? And again, this is going to be based on, if you got pencil and plain film, but for purposes of just review for anybody out there. And then we're going to be a 1/4 inch behind that, let's say, right? In practice, this is not what I do every day with this software, but just for review. So in practice, I'm going to bring my tool. All right. But the idea is you are capturing the plane of the posterior arch. You would draw a line through those 2 points, both at that intersection of the lateral mass and posterior arch, and then a 1/4 inch behind it. That's where you're scribing your line through. So you can do something similar by just dropping your line and capturing those 2 points. Now, sometimes, very rarely, but within our technique, we give a little bit of guidance when you get a double posterior arch. This particular person doesn't have that, but you could have 2 posterior arches. So you could have another one, kind of running up here. I'm not talking about a posterior ponicle, all right? I'm talking about basically what would be either aberrant condyles, so one condyle is higher than the other, which is throwing that off. You could have aberrant posterior arches. Genetically, you could even have a C2 body that's aberrant. But any of that could lead to 2 posterior arches, and the way the technique works is if you got 2 of them, you would do the same kind of a thing. You put your dot and then a 1/4 inch behind it, and then you would scribe a second line, right? And when you have 2 of these, you take the higher one. So you're going to derive your ASP line from your higher posterior arch. So you won't see that very often, but just to cover it, because I want this to be thorough. But let's talk, what is this ASP line even providing you, AdvO doc, right? With an ASP line, I get quality information for how to take my frontal film. So I know the angle, right? We got about 14 degrees here. And then I know the facial feature that I'm going to be aiming my central ray at. So by way of review, you have S0 through S5, right? And S0 is through the lips. S1, bottom of the nose. S2, kind of bridge of the nose. Then the next 3 are going to be in reference to the ocular orbits. So S3, in the middle of the orbit. S4, S5 is kind of up like the eyebrow. And just in terms of looking at me on the screen, S0, right? S1, S2, S3, 4, 5. And that's going to tell me where that collimator light, that central ray, is going to line up and crosshairs on the facial feature. And I will have turned the tube to 14 degrees. So in this case, we'd be looking at and S2 effectively at 14 degrees. So that's going to be, how I'm going to shoot that frontal film. All right, let me just get those off. I'll clear those off here real quick. So next, right, what else am I going to dig out of this film? Why else is it relevant? Well, how are you going to take your axial view, AP open mouth, for some of the others outside of AO and AdvO? How am I going to take that axial view and on what angle? So one of the things to consider is, why not just pull the axial circumference, right? That's one of the measurements that it's going into your analysis. Why not just pull that off of your frontal film? That's very historic. That's the historic way to do it in upper cervical, orthogonal analysis. Well, let me pitch you for why. This is the AdvO rationale for why, is you should want to capture the circumference for that axial surface on the plane that it sits on, right? So if you look at this S line, if I was to measure the axial surface of that C2 based on the frontal film, what am I even measuring? I'm back here on like the posterior aspect of that surface and maybe even into the lamina a little bit, or this is not good. What am I doing? So here's the rationale, okay? And why does it matter? Well, if you take it along the actual surface, which you can pull out with the George's line of C2 on that body, right? Look at the difference in those two angles. That's crazy. But it's very common. 24 degrees, anywhere from 10 to 30 degrees you would almost expect. But the problem is when you come from that ASP line angle, what the surface is going to look like, it's going to be much more rounded. And who cares? Well, you should, because that's going to result in a much shallower line of drive on your Z measurement, how it's computed. You're going to have a much shallower, flatter Z. It's not going to be as high. The angle on your Z, when you go to set up the instrument head, will be much higher if you have a more accurate, flatter surface. As that number becomes rounder, it could be 10 degrees or more flat and too shallow, because that axial circumference makes up, that's your C over A measurement, how you basically derive your height for the adjusting angle. So draw a George's line, a 90-degree angle off of the back of that body, and that is the angle you should be taking your open mouth axial view at. So here you'd be on a -11, and I'd be aiming at that lower lip before I have them open their mouth. All right, moving on. Locating the transverse process. Now, I know it can seem like maybe if this is not how you practice, this is too much detail, but I'm telling you, this one is important too. This is huge. Just like that height on your Z is really important, making sure you're aiming the instrument at the thing you're supposed to be aiming the instrument at is huge. So let's just give you a few references and talk about, again, why this is relevant. Doing mastoid and that mandible, okay? So let's assume, because that's what a lot of us might be doing, that your transverse process is in the tragus notch. I can tell you looking at this already it's not, right? Because I can see, if I got the dens down here, all right, even visibly, before I get into how to do this, I'm looking at that posterior arch, and I'm seeing a lot of structure going on around here. All right. But so just by way of example, okay? If I assume that my transverse process is here, right? but it's actually here. Now we got a problem. Why do we have a problem? Well, let's say I'm lining up my instrument. Right? Let's say you got a posterior, an atlas that needs to be moving anterior. It's posterior. You're posterior to it, right? Well, now look at where I'm at relative to this guy. Relative to this guy. I should be behind him, pushing him anterior, and now I'm in front of him, pushing him posterior. Do you think that could create a problem with reducing that posterior rotation that you measured? Yeah, I'd say so. And you're high. You're much higher than you should be too. All right. So beyond why you should, you should actually measure where it's at. So let's get this out of here, this junk here. But how do you do that, right? How do you figure out exactly where this guy is? Well, it's going to come from, knowing where your AFP is on your frontal film, right? Where that posterior arch is on your ASP line, on your sagittal view. Let me toggle over to her. Okay, so all right, so if we look at her frontal film and I have her AFP, or atlas frontal plane, right? I'm at that posterior arch lateral mass, inferior aspect of posterior arch reference point. That should correspond with, we'll do both these, with here, okay? Where are my transverse processes in relationship to that AFP line? Are they north of it, superior, or inferior? And right now I'm just talking about both of them, right? You could have, people got weird transverse processes, right? You can have transverse processes that are doing something crazy like this. Let's say they're hard inferior, right? If that's the case, on my sagittal view, where should I be looking for those transverse processes? Well, they may be even lower. They may be like down here, okay, right? So let me get rid of those. And then secondarily, when I consider independently one transverse process to the other, right and left, for her, she was a left. We did all our analysis, right? She's a left listing. So not only do I need to know where the transverse processes are as a whole, where is the actual one that I want to contact? I want the left one, correct? So if I want the left transverse process relative to that atlas frontal plane, where is that one sitting? Well, it's a little higher, right? There's a little bit of tilt going on here, but this one's going to be higher, right? So I should be looking for the higher of 2, okay? And now also to consider, let's do this, is rotation. So I need to know height and rotation, so I'm in the right ballpark. Well, her rotation is 0.55, right. So she's left posterior. So it should be slightly posterior. The left one, correct? Should be slightly posterior and slightly higher than the right one. Now I want to make sure I'm not marking the dens. Okay, this is important. All right. So if I look, right, this is overall the dens here. But I start to notice I have some white, heavier on the white here. And I'm looking for this little edge I can see. right? That's going to be the 1. And then just slightly anterior and below, we'll have the other. Okay, so I have right and left. Let me clean this up a little bit. We'll take off that anterior, right? That is the correct transverse process. So now when I go to set up on her, that is where I'm aiming, right? If I'm up here, we got a problem. And even if you're close, right? Even if you took some of that measuring that we just did and you were slightly off, maybe you miffed it and you picked the anterior and slightly low one, you're still light years better off than just shooting in the tragus notch. Does that make sense? All right. So I really loved this quote. I'm going to read a quote here from one of my binders from the seminars back in the day. I thought it captured why this is important. The transverse process on the side of laterality must be identified, marked, and recorded. Only after this step is taken can an orthogonal doctor properly align the instrument to deliver a precise adjustment. Failing to perform this essential step will result in the administering of an inaccurate adjustment. Serious negative outcomes may occur, including the patient not clearing, not holding, or the subluxation worsening, like I mentioned, right? If you could be kicking it further posterior on accident, you could be too high or too low. So harm can be done to patients. Not to hammer too hard, but I know all of you care about how well your patients are clearing and if they're holding. So that's why this is important. Last thing, dimensional transpositioning. So I mentioned it on the frontal film video, and I'll put a link for that video in this one. That is where I really covered it in detail. But the sagittal film is part of that cross-reference. So let's get this guy out of here. Dimensional transpositioning. What is that again? Well, it's not always easy to identify the C2 spinous process on a frontal film. You got the posterior arch here captured by that AFP line. You can see that, right? We can see the lateral masses of the atlas. You can make all that up, but it gets a little fuzzy, right? We start getting around that dens. You see these, what's going on? It can get a little hard, right? Well, you have your sagittal film to cross-reference when you're trying to figure out what is the height in terms of how far is the spinous process from that atlas sagittal plane line, right? i.e. the AFP from the frontal view. Well, you can measure, let's say, just for example, to give a little bit of a gap, I can measure how far, I'll be, for instance, right? And then that can translate over to that front view as well. And you can measure, see, I'm even off a little bit here on the one I did. You can get the same height when you're going to look for where that C2 spinous tip is. You should be able to dimensionally transpose in terms of height. Now, there's also the rotational component of it, like left or right. Where's that C2 spinous? But the sagittal film will be incredibly relevant when you're trying to figure out how far down is that spinous tip, right? Where's that spinous tip from the atlas frontal plane? But on the sagittal view, it would be the ASP. So I wanted to mention that as well. That's sort of a bonus that you can pull off of your sagittal films. So Hope that was helpful. Listen, again, if you haven't been to a seminar in a while, an AdvO seminar, it's time. Our group is really doing good things. Again, we got a new website up. Check it out. But stay tuned for more of these videos. I'm going to be putting up more of these analysis tutorials. I want to get into how to set up x-rays. I want to talk about table placement and how it relates to all the different factors. I really want to create a cache of valuable information for students and doctors to come back to and check out on Facebook and find interesting and stir up some conversation and just be of a lot of value for you guys. But other than that, God bless and have a great day.